the impact that they are defining. And I think a big part of that, as an advisor, so Bridgespan is a nonprofit consulting firm, but I've really kind of owned the role of advisor. That it's very much about creating the space and creating the opportunities both for introspection but also collaboration.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen.
Okay, good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm really delighted with today's guest who will introduce himself. Nate, please go ahead.
Hi, Maurice. So good to be with you today. My name is Nate Wong. I am a partner at the Bridgespan Group based in Washington, D.C.
Great. And how long have you been there?
I've been a Bridgespan for almost 3 years.
Okay. Yeah, not that long, but long enough to have, a lot of stories and anecdotes about it. I would like to go there at one point, but what the listeners know is I'm also, together with the listeners, really interested in, where were you born? Tell us a little bit about your upbringing. Do you have siblings, who took care of you? And how might that have informed, to ultimately, studying systems engineering and then going to your, master's. So yeah, tell us about that, please, Nate.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'm Chinese ethnically. My background is a little bit interesting. My dad grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii. His grandparents immigrated to Hawaii to pick pineapples. And then later his parents went on to own and operate a Chinese restaurant. And then on my mom's side, she grew up in Suva, Fiji Islands, and received a scholarship to study in the US at the University of Hawaii in the hospitality industry. And in Hawaii is where my mom and dad met. I give a little bit of that background because it obviously influences how I see the world. I think Hawaii is an interesting place in that it's a true melding of a lot of different experiences. Many people refer to Hawaii as a mixing bowl rather than a melting pot, in that it really does hold individual cultures, but also sees a lot of those cultures intersecting each other. So I'm an only child, I'm a son, and as we talked about, very much have been really grew up in an Asian culture where there are a lot of expectations placed on children, especially sons, many of them that are unspoken. So very much my story is the plight of the immigrant family in the US, and paying it forward and paving the way for the next generation to have an easier life. So I'm a product of the sacrifices that my parents made for me. When I grew up, a lot of the expectations that maybe were less said explicitly, but were very much known, is that there were really 3 acceptable jobs. It could be an engineer and follow in my dad's footsteps. It could be a doctor or maybe an accountant. And that's kind of what actually led me into engineering. Not a really great rationale, that I think for them, stability was really the mantra So I didn't really grow up with the language around purpose. And if I'm honest, it feels very privileged and kind of lofty to think about purpose. The goal that my parents instilled in me was much more about, having a stable job, having a family, being able to support yourself and your family. And so it was much later that I kind of found my own version of purpose. And it actually started, as as you mentioned, studied systems engineering, but then went into management consulting right out of undergrad. And I did a trip to Brazil and worked with a local nonprofit that was doing a lot of work with children and youth in the favelas. And that was really a moment for me where I was seeing the application of, you know, different business concepts or maybe the lack thereof being applied to the nonprofit space. And that really set me on a path to explore how can I think differently about using the skills that I was learning in consulting, but apply them in maybe more meaningful ways. So my career has been a lot of zigging and zagging and
Mhm.
testing out a lot of different hypotheses.
I would like to go a bit back to Hawaii. So you were born and raised there, or did your parents move from Hawaii to because I know you're now on the West Coast. Oh, sorry, on the East Coast. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually interesting. I grew up in DC, right outside of DC. So
okay,
my parents met in Hawaii, and then my
yeah,
dad came to DC for
hmm,
school, for graduate school in um, a Catholic university
uh-huh.
in DC, and then ended up working in government. And so that was kind of where I grew up. So I'm one of those weird people that have actually grown up in DC, despite DC being one of those transient places.
Hmm. Okay, okay, and and so thanks for explaining in terms of how you got into the systems engineering. But then I mean, and I totally understand that, it's kind of unspoken and you end up, choosing a study that, yeah, falls into the, what you think is acceptable to the family. But were you also good at the topics? Because there's one thing that you, you have to do something, but, you, yeah, how was that?
Yeah.
And did you have fun doing it ultimately? Or was it not even, yeah, not a question if it had to be fun. You just had to do it. How did you look at that?
Yeah, I am analytical by nature,
Mhm.
and pretty decent at math. So
Yeah.
I think I was quote unquote good at it.
Mhm.
Did it feel meaningful? No. And I think I'm a person that likes to like optimize things. And so my trip to Brazil was a moment where it's like, oh, I never thought about optimizing things with an impact lens to it.
Mm.
And so that was kind of my a bit of an aha moment. If I think less from a business perspective and more from the perspective of how do I care for a particular cause or see a social outcome achieved, how do you optimize for that? And that felt like a very different lens to apply, kind of something I was quote unquote good at, but is way more tricky. Like you can't put it in a mathematical model or do a simulation to optimize. There are like so many competing variables when you talk about social progress. So that actually created a more complex set of things to wade into.
Mm.
Which, sometimes I ask myself like, why did I choose them? It feels like way harder. But it also feels way more meaningful as
Mm,
well.
yeah. I, no, thanks. And I would like to go back to that experience in Brazil, because I saw that at that time you were part of Deloitte somehow, right? When that happened,
Correct.
and I know one of your bosses was explaining that it was, that it made a difference, that it opened up your eyes, and you were mentioned in the video that I saw of him. And what I wanted to ask you is, you know, can you really describe, was it a moment? Was it a whole experience? What was it that made you, okay, this is a revelation, and I'm going now, instead of
Mm.
right, I go left, or, you know?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can explain like a single moment.
Hmm.
I think, I was in just such a different context than I previously was in before. So being in the favelas, it um was just seeing desperation and poverty unlike any that I was exposed to. And then seeing a small NGO that was creating opportunities for, frankly, kids to be kids. There was just a lot of gang violence that pervaded this particular community. And they were doing a lot of work that was like, how can we use sports and how can we use community to engage kids in this like critical time after school but before dinner where kids can be kids. And it sounds like kind of a very simplistic idea. Um but I think they like were on to something. And then they as an organization were really so focused on delivering, for these kids themselves that I think operationally there were just so many inefficiencies. And that's kind of what I observed. I saw like the heart behind so many of these leaders that, sacrificed a lot, like their own families. Some people traveled 2 hours just to get to the favelas to be there. Some just held space for um, these kids that had witnessed really horrific atrocities and violence. But I think there was a question around like what that is amazing, and what is the sustainability of that organization, and like how does it help more people? Can it help more people through this model? And I just saw that there were a lot of elements that they didn't codify, they didn't really take stock of. And my systems engineering brain kind of went to like, I wonder what systems may need to be built there. And just recognizing so much humility around, it's easy for me as an American with a very different context to parachute in. It's very different to like have the everyday lived experience of operating in this community. And so it was more of just like asking questions rather than being in a place of like, I think you need to optimize XYZ. Um, but those were kind of questions that I
Yeah.
I was left wrestling with. And if I'm really honest, at that time, there was a naivete around, oh, great. Like I have learned all of these concepts. Like, um how can I like help? And that felt like a place where I could. Um, and I had to learn really quickly the importance of not asserting a perspective in a context that I may not be as familiar with. So those were really foundational and formative learning experiences for me.
Hmm. Okay. So then you get back in the US, and okay, then talk us through that. What happened then? Because ultimately you end up going to another organization, right? And 3 years ago you went to Bridgespan. But talk us through. Okay, you come back in DC. You were working for Deloitte, but then did you then leave, or did you try to incorporate what you've learned in the that works? So yeah, talk us through that.
Yeah. Yeah, my experience with Deloitte is pretty interesting. I left 4 times and came back 3
Yeah.
times is the interesting relationship with Deloitte. And so when I came back after my trip, um, I was actually determined to do more social impact work, and the firm didn't have as many opportunities. So I actually ended up taking a sabbatical from Deloitte. It was one of the first times they offered it. It was still like early days social entrepreneurship, impact investing. And so I ended up working. I took a sabbatical for 6 months, worked in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically in South Africa and Mozambique, on a Gates Foundation project. And that was like my real foray into global development. Um, and then that really set a very different course for me. But it was an opportunity that felt important at the time. I think in typical management consulting arenas, you do your management consulting work for 2 years, then you go to business school. So this was instead of going to business school, let me actually explore in a tangible way what it would be like to engage in more meaningful social impact work. And one of my kind of quote unquote tests, if you will, was, how do I situate myself in global development? Um, so that was like a really fascinating experience. I worked in Johannesburg and Maputo, in Mozambique, and it was really around it was an analysis to look at the potential for a thriving soybean industry in the region. And there was a team of 4 of us, and we were all spread into different countries to really look at what was the potential in each of these countries for that. So it meant talking to smallholder farmers, talking to Ministry of Agriculture, getting a lot of data, some that existed, some that didn't. And ultimately, a lot of the facts were smallholder farmers were being squeezed by middle players that were essentially capturing value between harvest time and selling soybeans with you know at the market. And so there was some questions around like, how do you actually get more value for the smallholder farmer, and what are the ways to do that? So it was a fascinating project. And then when I went back to the States, um, Deloitte had the opportunity. They had acquired a different firm and opened up an international development practice. And so I went into that practice and did a lot more work with USAID, UN, some of those players, and really did more on the economic development side of the house in sub-Saharan Africa as well as the Middle East.
Wow. And but you also had a track, and I don't know if this was at the same time or later, where you went into teaching as well, right? And
Yeah, so that was
how did that
later.
was later?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But maybe if I can um finish the
Yeah, sure.
Deloitte
Yeah, yeah.
side. So that was like one stint away, came back, then left again to work at a startup in Cairo, Egypt. I was a little bit disillusioned with the global development space, um, s- specifically some of the bureaucracy that exists in some of the large multinational organizations, and wanted to get closer to the impact. So with more social entrepreneurship happening and more the early days of impact investing, became very interested in that. Um, I later went to business school and then had the opportunity to go back to Deloitte to help launch their social impact practice. So that was like my last foray at Deloitte, and ended up doing a mix of global development work, but also a lot more domestic work, especially um, like very early days of social justice, kind of the more recent social justice efforts, particularly after the murder of Trayvon Martin and the establishment from the Obama White House of initiative called My Brother's Keeper. So that was kind of my last foray within Deloitte. Ultimately, that practice closed. I think there's been many different versions of purpose or social impact. But then I was faced with the choice: do I stay at Deloitte? Do I go back into general consulting? Or do I continue the path focused on social impact? And I ended up leaving Deloitte, joined briefly the Obama Foundation in its early days, and then did more work around city innovation post 2016, given the political climate that existed in DC and beyond. Um, and then went to Georgetown University and was part of the leadership team at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. And that's where I did both a mix of teaching, but also focused on our incubator side that was trying to scale ideas that could be transplanted inside institutions like government.
Wow. That's pretty
A
impressive,
lot of
all of that.
circuitous
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
paths.
Native, and I should have asked an earlier guest as well, but I think there are quite a lot of people out there, they have no clue. What is social impact investing?
Yeah.
What is your elevator speech around that? Or it can be more than an elevator speech, but um, yeah. Can you explain in relatively simple language for the listeners? How is it different than some of that global development that you were part of as well? And, you had some
Mm.
a little bit disillusioned, and especially the bigger institutions there. Yeah.
Yeah. Impact investing is a stream of investing that looks to hold both financial return and social impact return. There's a whole spectrum around what social impact return looks like. But if we can keep it simple, it is essentially that there are certain social impact returns that exist, and that can be measured in terms of environmental, it can be governance related, it could be, a social outcome being achieved. And a lot of the early days of impact investing was in social enterprises. So businesses that had a business model that could produce a financial profit alongside some of their, impact returns. I think some of us probably know organizations like Tom Shoes or like Warby Parker that have models where the revenue side and the impact side are aligned. There's some questions, obviously, of like the impact of that and is that the right type of impact?
Mhm.
But those are kind of examples of larger social enterprises that many of us probably are kind of familiar with now.
Okay. Yeah. And just for the listeners who are not familiar with Tom Shoes, and because I don't even know if Tom Shoes are also in Europe, maybe they are, but basically the model is, so if you buy a pair of Tom shoes, then what is happening is that another pair of shoes is provided to people in need around the world, right? I mean, it's
Exactly.
one aspect of it. So yeah, tell us a bit about, you got involved in with teaching around Georgetown, and yeah, is that in combination with the work that you continue to do, so the social impact investing, or is it really separate tracks? Yeah, tell a bit
Yeah.
about.
It was a little separate. I had
Mm.
an opportunity to create a new course for
Uh-huh.
undergrad students, and my course was named Building a Social Impact Consciousness. And so it gets at, you can teach some of the mechanics of, what is a social enterprise, what is impact investing, some of the things that we talked about just now. Um, and I was pretty confident that, there's actually a lot of curriculum that now exists around that. What felt missing was more of the kind of ethical framework or the introspection of of why do you want to do social impact? What are your motivations? How do you think the complexity of your identity and how that shows up in your work, or the proximity of lived experience connected to your work? Those types of concepts didn't feel taught in a robust way. They were kind of layered on or added on to more kind of core hard quote unquote skills. So my course was very much thinking about some of those tough introspective questions of like, what type of impact do you want? When there are trade-offs, how do you make those trade-offs? I think we're facing that very much in this environment where we're holding a lot of different competing priorities at stake. Do we want to support certain companies and also get the benefit of convenience like an Amazon? Um, and so I think that there's those types of questions that are really important, along with as you grow as a leader, like how do you invest in yourself and
Yeah.
your own well-being too? Those are things that oftentimes aren't taught in school, and we almost have to unlearn them later, or I felt that very much. Um, that I had to like really interrogate, who am I as a leader? What are the stances that I want to take or not take? And I also was leading in the time of George Floyd and
Uh-huh.
COVID, and like some of these questions were very live and real
Uh,
for me. Um, so that was kind of the context of that
yeah.
that class, and I wanted to do it in an open source way so that other people could benefit. You didn't have to be a registered Georgetown student to
Okay. Oh,
get
interesting.
the
Yeah.
class content, and so
Hmm.
it's actually available online, for those who want to engage.
Yeah. And you're still doing that. You're still teaching.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. Okay. If you allow me, I would like to make a jump. And I do would like to come back to the Bridgespan as well, but the jump I would like to make is, also the world. I mean, if you talk about social impact, ultimately, you're trying to contribute to making this world more just, more sustainable. And I think, although it's not perfect, but a lot of discussions were taking place after the Millennium Development Goals were developed into 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Something that we need to reach before 2030. SDG 1, end poverty, SDG 2, end hunger, etc. unfortunately, we are in 2025, so 5 more years ago, and on average, we are only at 15 to 17% in reaching those. And a growing group of people around the world is saying that, one of the reasons that we are not reaching those goals is because we did not pay proper attention to the abilities, skills, and knowledge that you need as an individual as well as a community. So you want to see those system changes, process changes, but you need to work on yourself. So that's why I make the bridge, because that's something you mentioned as well. So in order to work on those 5 inner development goals, being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting, 23 skills are apparently necessary to work on. Empathy, critical thinking, etc. So my question to you is, have you heard about the inner development goals? One, if you heard of them, what is your opinion about it? If you did not hear about them, still, what is your opinion? And how does that maybe relate also what you just mentioned in terms of what you were trying to do in your course, right? And something that you discovered yourself.
Yeah. I have heard of them, and I thought it was pretty genius in terms of shifting the conversation to the individual. And I'm also a leadership coach, and one of the main mantras is your inner game runs your outer game. And so we can talk about all of these, the externalized version of the SDGs, which I think is really more of a collaboration framework for how do we collectively think about, a few really major goals that we can collectively act upon. But this like inner development framework, I think really talks about much more of starting. I love the start of like your relationship to self. I think so much of how we operate is around output. And I think that there's a real conversation and awareness now that is being made to like, are we self-aware? Are we how are we operating out at places of authenticity and integrity? Because once we act, it might be for maybe with good intentions, but they oftentimes have unintended consequences. And I've been, my parents both came from, colonial upbringings, in the Fiji Islands and Hawaii. I think that there's a lot of unintended consequences, and some of them were intended consequences, and those take many, many years to undo. And so if we start first with like our role as individuals, and then how do we do that in relationship with others, I think it really starts to shift the dynamic. Many people might think of the inner development goals as a little bit woo-woo or like not as tangible. I see them as like interrelated. Like, how do you actually hold both of those frames? And we're in a moment where so many leaders are burnt out. And when you're burnt out, you're actually taken off the field, if you will. And so I think that there's a way to show up in a space of wellness that holds all of the complexities of the world. And how do we do that in a way that is authentic?
Okay. I would like to take a little jump, back. And so, when you went through this, so you go to Brazil, that is, kind of giving a different perspective. And slowly you're incorporating much more. You realize you need to work on yourself as well. What did your parents, how did they observe what was happening with you in terms of, how did that go? And do you have conversations with them around that? And has their opinion maybe shifted as a result of your, evolving and involvement and development?
Yeah. Well, my parents are it's kind of a funny story. I think they honestly did not know what was going on with me. Um to be honest, they were like, "You work at Deloitte, so you must do accounting." And so we just are glad that you have a job and that you are doing something stable. I really don't think they fully understood the work that I was doing. I kept a blog while I was in South Africa and Mozambique, almost as a way for me to process everything that I was, experiencing and working through. They read it, but I think that there is a little bit of distance that they had from actually understanding a lot of the concepts. If I'm quite honest, that probably created a little bit of a rift between us and their ability to relate to me. And if I unpack that more, I think a lot of their mindset was they were very much in survival mode. And I was coming into the world with more of a how do I flourish? I'm
Mm.
not in survival mode. I'm thinking about broader, deeper questions about humanity that frankly they didn't necessarily have the luxury to think about.
Uh-huh.
And so those were harder conversations for us to have. And I think as I have grown older, my mom actually passed a year ago, or
So
like a
sorry.
little less than a year ago. And some of our later conversations were much more about legacy. And
Yeah.
I do think when we, not to get morbid, but when we think about, our time on this earth is finite, what do we pass on? It does start to change the level of conversation. It is
Mm.
oftentimes less about output. It is about who are the relationships that you've invested in? What is the impact that you want to have? No one is looking at your bank account. No one is looking at your resume. They're looking at the impact that you had on people and the world. And so I think my parents' mentality was very much survive and like have a stable life, and then you can think about the impact that you want. And I kind of flip that a bit.
Uh-huh.
And so that to them was very much a very weird way of thinking.
Mm. And were you able then to ultimately, uh, get to a place with them in that they understood more what you were trying to do and appreciate that? How did that go, or was it always a little bit, it remained kind of okay? We just leave each other as is.
I think they started to understand
Uh-huh.
what I was doing. I don't think they will fully know kind of why I made the choices that I made. Why did I have to go to abroad? Why did I go abroad? Or why did I focus on racial justice issues? Those I think are a little bit open questions for them. But the idea that I wanted to make an impact, I think they started to understand. Um, so that has been helpful, but I think for me, I've had to weigh like both truths, that they might not fully understand the work that I do and being actually quite satisfied with like that is still what I want to do. And I'm whether they understand it or not. I think the other thread that is going on in the background here is me wrestling through my own sexuality.
Yeah.
And so I think part of my process of operating authentically was um, to actually interrogate like, who am I with all of the different elements that show up, my race, my ethnicity, my lived experiences, my sexuality, like how does that show up in my life, but
Mm.
also how does that influence my work? And I think for me, I've always had a sense toward those who have been on the margins.
Mhm.
And I didn't connect the dots until later that a big part of that motivation was because I felt like I was on the margins. I
Yeah.
felt that I didn't always belong and I had to navigate the world by code switching and figuring out like who do I need to be to show up in a particular setting. And it's taken me decades to figure out
Mhm.
like who that is and like being able to live more in confidence with all of those different identities and intersections of identities that show up. And I don't think my parents had that luxury. And so it's something that I kind of lament as my
Uh-huh.
mom passed that we weren't able to have
Uh,
that deeper conversation. I think we understood that those were the choices that I made. But yeah, those are all quite tricky.
mhm.
Yeah. And are you able to go there with your dad?
Yeah, I came out to my parents,
Mhm.
and we have a good relationship. And I would say, my final days with my mom, we were able to come to some deeper peace
Mm.
of not only my identity, but just a lot of the elements that I think I carry forward
Uh-huh.
from both of my parents. They come from the hospitality industry. Their families both owned restaurants. And if I take a fuller view of hospitality, like that is how I show up. I love
Mm.
kind of inviting people in and having a broader sense of belonging. And that is the legacy that I feel like I've inherited from my
Uh-huh.
my family that I carry forward
Yeah.
in how I do the work. So like
Okay.
that type of connection I think is important and I honor with both of my parents.
Mhm. Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, and thank you for sharing, Nate. Yeah. Um, and I really think it's a great message also, and I'm appreciate it, and I know the listeners well as well. Um, I would like to go to your present job, and that's the last 3 years you are a partner at Bridgespan, and so you also said about your legacy. So let us talk about it. What do you hope? That ultimately, whenever you leave your present job, what do you hope that you will leave behind?
Yeah, I very much feel like part of my role is to set the conditions for other leaders um, to help achieve the impact
Uh-huh.
that they are defining. And I think a big part of that as an advisor, so Bridgespan is a nonprofit consulting firm,
Uh-huh.
but I've really kind of owned the role of advisor that it's very much about creating the space and creating the opportunities both for introspection, but also collaboration with other field actors. And so my legacy, I hope, is how do I that I've like created those moments of real connection and opportunity for leaders to further the work that they're doing. I have a perspective that a big part of the the type of work and the type of leaders that I support are all focused on what I would call power shifting work. And so that is still bringing into the fold like those who are on the margins and really interrogating who has power, who has agency to influence the decisions on particular communities. Hopefully, it's those communities themselves or a representative of those communities. And we know that that's not always true. And we know that there's power dynamics that exist even within the social sector or social impact between donors and philanthropists and nonprofits. And so, like, where there are opportunities to level that playing field or to shift power, or to have communities recognize the power that an agency that they actually have, like, I would love to help influence that. So that's hopefully the legacy that I will have.
Um, and for me, in order to get there, we need to listen and connect with each other, and that's the first step, or one of the first steps. And what I hope that this podcast will contribute to is connection. We are connected. I connect you with the listeners. I'm also going to connect you with the previous guest, and the previous guest has a question for you.
What do you think are good ways through which we can bridge our work across sectors and disciplines? And yeah, what have been your positive experiences with getting people from different disciplines together? And if I may extend the question a little bit, are there things that we should do earlier on in our education, maybe in primary or secondary education, to give people the skills they need to work across sectors and across disciplines?
Yeah. I think it's firstly such a great question, and I do think probably our education system and even the world of philanthropy and the social impact space does tend to silo issue areas and does not work across intersections. So the fact that there are these silos is part of the problem. I think one of the major ways to disrupt that is, it sounds very obvious, but getting out of our silos. And we oftentimes don't have the luxury or even the time to sit in other people's areas of expertise. And so one of the things that I think can be really helpful is finding moments where you're interacting with other people outside of your normal area of expertise. And I do think curiosity is a muscle that you have to build. Unfortunately, at least in Western society, we're rewarded by being a deep expert. And I feel like as a generalist that sees a lot of different issue areas, I have the luxury to bridge. I mean, part of the way Bridgespan, the reason why Bridgespan is called Bridgespan is that we bridge a lot of different divides. First and foremost, it's usually between philanthropy and nonprofits, but I think it's also doing the pattern recognition across sectors and disciplines. So I 100% believe that there are moments that we need to have that can build those bridges. Um, I'm somewhat skeptical of just like general convenings that try to do that because it tries to create these bridges in maybe a little more artificial way. And I do wonder, I've been in a fellowship with the Aspen Institute that is a 4-year journey where we are trying to actually hold a lot of complexity. It's the Civil Society Fellowship, and it's across political difference, it's across geographic difference, racial difference, religious difference. And I think it's with the intent of how do we learn from each other? And one of the things that I think is hardest, to get to the second part of your question, like, do we have the right systems or like what's the right skills? Is I think we've lost the skill to debate and to negotiate with each other. I think social media and technology have actually created more silos, and we've retreated into like spaces where we're in echo chambers. So we don't always have the like discourse to say, I don't know if I agree with you, or tell me more about that particular lens, or what in your past experience led you to that belief, and this is my version of it. So that's kind of, that's an opportunity where it's quite spacious. We have a week together, where we're like in deep conversation around a lot of different topics. But it is for the purpose of bridging and not necessarily trying to solve the solution, or like to um collaborate for a particular purpose. It is actually just understanding each other as humans. And I kind of feel like that's the first step. We have to see each other as humans, not necessarily I I only want to work with you because I think you have this perspective that will be valuable in my work. Like, part of it is the discovery of how we can be helpful to each other. And some of that is just connecting because we have a shared experience with death of a loved one, challenging family dynamics, the real life aspects that connect us to each other. So that's maybe a more meta version of what the question from the previous guest is asking, around the tactics of bridging. But I do think it requires connecting as humans first.
Before I ask you to come up with the question for the next guest, I just want to, a kind of little story that I always use is about Sesame Street, and where Ernie, from Ernie and Bert, wants to learn how to play the saxophone. And when he plays the saxophone, you hear all the time a streaky sound, because what's happening is that he always walks around with his rubber ducky, and he doesn't want to let go of his rubber ducky. And so the band ultimately says, well, Ernie, if you want to learn how to play the saxophone, you need to put your ducky down if you really want to learn. So yeah, I'm interested. What is your ducky?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think my ducky is a belief that that I'm right. Like, just even being able to hold that my lived experience can be my lived experience, but it doesn't have to be, it doesn't mean your lived experience um discounts mine. And so I think oftentimes, because I work with marginalized populations, I feel like this sense of fight against others. And I think that's kind of a ducky that I need to let go of at times, because it can prevent me from being curious.
And again, and my listeners know this, that I always say this, the fact that you have to put your ducky down doesn't mean you cannot pick up your ducky again. So let us be clear about that.
100%. Yeah.
Your question for the next guest, Nate.
This is an interesting one. I feel like we're in an environment where there's so much polarization.
Mm.
And my question is, what do you do with all the rage? How do you channel it?
Okay. Music is very important to me, so I always have a question about music as well. So the question is, if you had to choose a song or a piece of music that represents for a big part who you are, what you are about, which song or a piece of music would that be and why?
So I wrestled with
You're not the
which
only one, Nate. All my
song to
guests are
come up
saying.
with. Yeah. um I want to channel my mom actually. One of her favorite songs that we ended up playing at her celebration of life was Aloha Oi. It's a Hawaiian song. And I don't think many people know its origin stories. It was created by the last queen of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani. And a lot of the song is actually in Hawaiian, but the English translation is um, a farewell to thee, one fond embrace until we meet again. And I do think that there's something powerful about connection, um, and this notion that we can't take it with you. Like there is a farewell that we will have to make with sometimes it's with ourselves and sometimes it's with people we care about, and it ends until we meet again. And I think that there's just a beautiful notion that it's not like there's to the legacy point that we were talking about, there is a reconnection in some way later that is there for us. And so I think about that in terms of holding both the limits of our humanity as well as the ability to reconnect maybe at some later time with
Mhm.
the people we care about and love. So yeah, that's the song that kind of
Mm.
speaks to me, and I feel in this point of time is quite
Yeah.
meaningful.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And hopefully I can find it on Spotify. Aloha Hawaii is
Aloha Oi. Yeah.
away. Yeah. Um, and just for the listeners to remind them, all the songs, who were uh, selected by my guests are on a Spotify playlist, hashtag Walk Talk Listen, where you can find all kinds of songs from hard rock until blues, classical music. So I really encourage you to check it out. It's really interesting, especially if you think about, different people that I was able to talk with in the last, over more than 200 episodes. Yeah, any message, invitation, or question for the listeners from you?
Yeah, I love holding hard questions. And
Mhm.
so that's usually where my mind goes. I was reflecting a bit on the trip that I just came back from to Amsterdam with this Aspen group. And one of the tangible things that um, we were talking about is what is your anchor in a time where there's so much, instability, precariousness. And so that's the question that I'm still holding. Like, what is my anchor right now? And then I I think like a call to action is what is one small act that I can make or we can make, that just connects us with each other. And so something that I've learned over the last 6 months is actually the muscle to ask for help. It's something that culturally, I don't think, many of us, uh, you know, do ask for help. And so, like, how do you exercise that muscle in small ways? Um, and so for me, it's, asking, um, someone for dinner when it's been a particularly rough day,
Mhm.
or a ride to go pick up my car that's at the mechanic.
Uh,
Some of those like minor things when like technically I could call an Uber or I could like find ways to get there myself. But yeah, those are probably two
Yes.
questions that I would
Okay.
hold or ask
Yeah.
others to hold.
Okay. I actually I like that. And for me, what you're saying also relates back to the inner development goals, right? And to reach those 5 goals, you need to work on 23 skills. And how I have tried to talk about that is also what I've heard you mention a couple of times now is this muscle. And the same thing I always say, I used to have a 6-pack. I did not have to do anything for it. Now it's far, far away. But at least, I can make those even those weak muscles a little bit more tight, a little bit. My wife
There's
starts to
a six
laugh
pack
really hard.
underneath.
Somewhere when you start digging deep. But it is the same thing with empathy or with, if you are assuming that, because you had it once, it's still there. You need to practice those muscles. And I really appreciate, you comparing it with muscles, the muscle of curiosity for asking for help. If you never use it, it's going away and it's not doing, so that's really, I appreciate it. Yeah, I would like to thank you, Nate, for your willingness to talk with me today and, for, everything you do and for who you are. Is there one question that I did not ask you as yet that I should have asked you today?
I don't think so. I know that we talked briefly before about um youth and
uh-huh,
spirituality, and maybe
uh-huh.
that's like one that we can reflect on or close with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um I think in terms of teaching, one aspect that I've been pondering is and what I've been learning from a lot of my students is that our youth are pretty angsty. And I don't mean that in necessarily a bad way. I just think that there's just such a commitment to operating out of integrity. And
Mm,
I do think it oftentimes leads us to places of introspection and perhaps in places of spirituality. And so I think again to this notion of being a leadership coach, like the inner game runs the outer game, and
mhm,
so I I think that there's oftentimes these inner narratives that we tell ourselves that actually control how we behave externally. So, are we controlled by fear? Are we operating out of a place of scarcity, and therefore competition? Or are we operating out of abundance and then cooperation? Like those types of things, I think, are very much kind of the heart of how at least I have started to um, incorporate spirituality
mm,
much more into how I think about the world. But I think it's very much informed by this youthful
mm,
exuberance
mhm,
to like interrogate the really hard things. Like capitalism in its current form hasn't been working. So therefore, how do we radically reimagine what
mm,
it could look like? And I do think as we get older, that radical imagination starts to no longer be there, or like to use our metaphor about muscles, like it's a muscle that we have to continue to put forward and not get jaded around. So that's just something that I've been thinking about.
And I find it interesting that it's something that you've heard from your students, because of I mean, again, my listeners know during the 100-mile walk, I often talk with my co-walkers about, what's the purpose, and then spirituality, religion. And, it seems that the younger generation, especially in the Western countries of the world, are looking differently at religion and spirituality than maybe previous generation. It not all. I mean, you always have to be very careful with generalizing. And then, you're talking about subcultures and, all kinds of things. But it seems also that, there is a search. There is also a search for community. And maybe, in the quote unquote old days, church was providing that. And so now it's not. So you need to look for new forms of communities, and there is a longing for it as well. I don't know if you notice that from your students.
100%. And I think I would maybe say like a search for belonging. And some of that is like a very internal sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Like this has been such a, like people that, are now graduating, they didn't necessarily live through 9/11, like pre 9/11 days. And so like that's a very jarring experience, or living through the financial crisis and COVID. And like there's just so many events that like have marked their lifetime. And so just a sense of belonging and like feeling a sense of security in and of themselves. But then to your point about community, like belonging with others, how do I situate myself with others? And like what is that shared sense of identity or purpose? And that's hard right now.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nate. I really appreciated the conversation.
Yeah,
we will
thank you
make
so much.
sure that, in the podcast notes, we will mention, because you actually have a website of yourself, where you're describing what you're doing, and papers. You've written a lot of papers that people can check out as well. So I will make sure that they can find that in the podcast notes. Keep on doing what you do. Thank you so much.
It's so great being here. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.